The unmade Hobbit game is a bit of an outlier from what I usually cover on this channel. What TT Games was working on in 2009 wasn't necessarily cancelled, and more never fully entered into production. And unlike games like Fallout Van Buren, this story doesn't end with the metaphorical sword being reforged by fans. To be entirely honest, all that glitters here most definitely isn't gold. Work on the Hobbit tie-in was short, but the deep roots of the project stretch outwards through the troubled development of the films, the games that came after, and the future of a company that had built up a comfortable monotony. This is a story at the center of how licensed titles changed at the start of the HD age, and how LEGO games grew to be the monolith they'd become. While from the ashes of this project, new flames would flare everywhere from Weathertop to Mordor. This is the unmade Hobbit game. The production of the Hobbit films was cursed from the beginning. Even as far back as the original negotiations for The Lord of the Rings in 1995, director Peter Jackson and team's original plan wasn't just for adapting the trilogy, but to start out first with a film based on The Hobbit and only do 2 for Rings if it was a success. However, the production rights to Tolkien's books proved to be a complicated web between producer Saul Zaentz, United Artists, and their parent company MGM. The theatrical distribution rights to just The Hobbit proved difficult to untangle, and Miramax, who was leading the negotiation, only wanted to do 1 film for Rings instead. So Jackson would take his idea and move forward with New Line, who offered him a chance at not just 2, dividing the trilogy in half, but 3, 1 for each book. 10 years and 17 Oscars later, things weren't going much better. While rumors were swirling that something Bilbo-related was brewing at New Line, and MGM was finally ready to sit at the table, negotiating a deal between studios of that size would take time. On top of that, New Line was about 12 months out from a merger with Warner Brothers and embroiled in a legal battle over unpaid royalties with, well, the one person everyone wanted in charge. In 2007, the pieces would finally fall into place. Jackson and New Line would settle, and MGM and New Line would finally ink a deal. Jackson at this time, though, was deep into work on both The Adventures of Tintin and The Lovely Bones, so directorial duties would end up in the hands of Guillermo del Toro, who Jackson briefly worked with on the canceled Halo movie. While The Hobbit is now known as 3 films that very much act as a prequel to Jackson's first trilogy, at this stage only 2 were planned. 1 containing the entirety of Bilbo's story, leaning heavily on del Toro's unique style, and 1 bridge film, intending to connect the events of the smaller-scale Hobbit to the main trilogy. As production went on and frankly fell apart, this would change. However, at this time, the team was in a unique place to go a little off-book and fill in some gaps. The business with the necromancer, Gollum leaving the Misty Mountains, and even things like the early temptations of Saruman were all on the table. For the world of video games, things were also a bit complicated. During the release of the original Lord of the Rings films, the license was divided down the middle. EA had the rights to develop games from the films from New Line, and Sierra/Vivendi had the rights to the literary works of Tolkien. It was almost entirely by coincidence then that each book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy got a video game in some form at that time. Sierra would start with an adaptation of Fellowship the novel and subsequently cancel their 2 sequels, following it up instead with their Zelda-inspired Hobbit game. Electronic Arts with Stormfront and their team in Redwood Shores would also be working on a Fellowship game that would slip out of the first film's marketing window and be redubbed The Two Towers, with levels being added for the second in the trilogy. With its success, they'd followed up with what I've often called the perfect sleepover game in Return of the King. After the trilogy, however, EA would also scoop up the rest of the rights from Sierra until 2008, developing the likes of The Lord of the Rings Conquest from Pandemic and their own canceled project from Redwood Shores, codenamed The White Council. When EA's license would end and New Line's merger with Warner Brothers would go through, the rights to Tolkien's work would now fall under Warner Brothers Interactive, and the stage would be set for a new era of tie-in games. While all of this was happening, Warner Brothers Interactive's newest studio, TT Games, formerly Traveler's Tales, was on a bit of a hot streak. Following nearly a decade of Disney tie-ins and 2 proto-3D Sonic games on the Saturn, the studio struck a lucrative deal with the LEGO company to assist with reevaluating their place in gaming. One sort of absurd idea bubbled to the top, with the team retelling Star Wars films in LEGO form. In 2003, the studio would approach Lucasfilm with the demo and their idea, and the 2 LEGO Star Wars games would be born, releasing the prequels in 2005 and the original trilogy a year later, with both a LEGO Indiana Jones and a LEGO Batman on the horizon. TT Games had found a formula that worked, combining wacky collectathon action with the simple fun of playing with Legos. However, with that success, admittedly came some monotony. So when word would get to the studio that Warner was now in possession of the game rights for the new Hobbit film, director and studio founder John Burton would jump at the opportunity to be involved. In mid-2008, Warner Bros. Interactive would give Burton and team 6 months to develop their pitch for a Hobbit game, with it to be shown off to Jackson and Del Toro in New Zealand in February the next year. It's worth noting that TT weren't strangers to big fantasy movie tie-ins like this, as the same year they'd released the first LEGO Star Wars, they'd also released their first tie-in to the Chronicles of Narnia in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a film that, at least at the time, felt deliberately like a response to Jackson's work, with Burton himself acting as lead designer. As with that game, their work on tie-ins to its sequels and even their LEGO games, Burton and TT's ethos was to make the player feel like they were living within the world of the film, and try to adapt one-to-one the movie in game form. At this time, though, pre-production on The Hobbit was only just beginning, so for their pitch, TT would turn to adapting scenes from the original 3 Lord of the Rings films instead, creating 4 fully playable levels and 5 smaller tech demos. By Burton's own admission on a now-deleted video on his YouTube channel, the whole thing kind of got out of hand pretty quick. What's on display here is extremely polished for a pitch, and the idea of even going as far to readapt the Lord of the Rings films was also floated around the studio. From hiding from the Nazgul in the forest to fighting the Balrog under Moria, a wide range of scenes from Fellowship in particular are adapted here, with most of the playable builds focused on either the stealth of playing as a hobbit or the power of playing as a wizard from Middle-earth. It's not until the smaller scale tech demos that we see any real sword fighting, and even then it's fairly short, or in the case of the prologue battle, ripped straight from the film. This does make a lot of sense, after all it is an adaptation of The Hobbit. Ironing out how to make Frodo and subsequently Bilbo fun to play is the key here, and at least judging by the demos, I think they did a pretty good job. While it's not an immersive sim by any stretch, it does seem to accommodate an almost Far Cry-style openness, with Burton showcasing the different ways the Uruks can be fought or snuck past in the larger forest environment. It's a long way from the relatively rigid and linear structuring of the LEGO games, and honestly feels very air quotes next gen. The Gandalf combat, on the other hand, seems very well realized. While the Balrog fight seems likely to just be a series of quick-time events and a straightforward cinematic boss battle, the Saruman fight in particular showcases some great telekinesis. While Burton doesn't outright state it as an influence, it's hard to not think of The Force Unleashed when looking at this fight, which would have released while this pitch was in development. While I don't want to speculate too wildly, I'm curious if this was motivated by seeing earlier demos of LucasArts' projects while working with them on LEGO Star Wars, and if their intention was to license out the Euphoria middleware that made it possible. Either way, it's super cool to see, and feels a lot cooler than some other Magic users seen in Lord of the Rings games. All of this being said, it's hard to tell how much they were actually going to stray from the LEGO formula here. Both their Chronicles of Narnia games and even EA's own tie-ins feature replayability and bonus objectives in a very arcadey way similar to their LEGO hub world. While I'm not expecting Bilbo and Gandalf running around Rivendell like it's the Mos Eisley Cantina hub, it's hard for me to picture TT getting away from this, and feels almost confirmed by Burton showing design documents titled Lord of the Rings Arcade. This was very much intended to be a tie-in game in the old sense of the word, and while there's nothing wrong with that, it's worth keeping in mind. While making comparisons to LEGO, it seems that one of the tech demos goes as far to rip lines straight from the films and re-motion capture them to give cutscenes that play as closely to the source material as possible. While this was still fairly early in TT's time with the LEGO license, and most of the cutscenes at the time feature the trademark parody mumbling and miming rather than real dialogue, as they'd progress, something like this would become the norm, ironically with LEGO Lord of the Rings being the first to rip lines straight from the films they were adapting. What's on display here as a whole is pretty impressive, especially considering the short amount of time it was in development and that it's only really a pitch. By Burton's own reckoning, the project cost the team around $1 million and was really used to help show what they could do beyond LEGO. So it's interesting to see what a more photorealistic and less formulaic game would look like from them. After their 6 months was up in February 2009, Burton would fly from England to Weta Workshop in New Zealand with an Xbox 360 dev kit under his arm. At that time, both Jackson and Del Toro were just finishing up the treatments for their film, and following a brief tour of their special effects house, the three men would sit down with their prototype. It's worth pointing out that both Jackson and Del Toro were uniquely qualified for this meeting. Not only had both worked on the canceled Halo film a few years prior, but Jackson had gone as far to open his own game studio, Wingnut Interactive, which had worked alongside the Halo team to develop a canceled episodic spin-off dubbed Halo Chronicles. Del Toro as well at this time would have just started work on his game Insane with Volition, which would be canceled shortly before its publisher THQ would go under in 2012. Both directors would approve of the prototype, with Del Toro being particularly enthusiastic, giving TT the go-ahead. However, it was Warner Bros. Interactive who stepped in and refused to give the project green light for full development. Instead of a traditional tie-in adaptation, TT's parent company wanted a game that took place within the world of the movie, but wasn't necessarily a direct retelling, something Burton and team disagreed with. Honestly, this is understandable. Even without the Hobbit movie's tricky production, it was still hard to line up the development of a game with the release of a movie, something EA themselves had learned with their Lord of the Rings games. At the same time, the licensed game bubble was in the middle of a slow-motion pop at that point. While again, the aforementioned closure of THQ wouldn't happen for another couple years, those last few were particularly brutal, due in part to their refusal to adapt to a new market and their continued habit to underestimate the costs of this new HD era of game development. Warner was also already trying their new strategy of movie-adjacent games with DC, and while a lot of them weren't great, they had found themselves in a position not dissimilar to Sierra and EA on Lord of the Rings but with Batman. Just 6 months before TT's pitch, Pandemic Studios under EA had canceled their work on a tie-in to The Dark Knight, due in part to being behind schedule. Warner and Eidos, who had the rights to literary Batman, would find themselves releasing a game a year later, filling a gap in the market at the height of Bat Fever. This strategy of licensed games that weren't just adaptations was becoming the name of the game, at least for those without Lego in the title. For Burton and team, that meant returning to the UK to continue work on just that, with TT releasing on average 1.5 Lego games a year for the next 12 years, with some titles being obvious such as Lego Harry Potter, and others a little unexpected like Lego Rock Band. For the production of The Hobbit, however, things were starting to change. For one, with the writing of the scripts underway for most of 2009, the idea of a true bridge film would start to slip, and the story of The Hobbit would instead grow to fully encompass the two movies. With those scripts expected to be finished no earlier than the start of 2010, production would be pushed back, and the original planned release date of December 2011 and 2012 were beginning to feel unlikely. Warner Bros. COO Alan Horn would go as far to state the project was very likely to slip a whole year. In an interview with Guillermo del Toro on horror site ShockTillYouDrop.com in May of 2010, however, it seemed things were worse than expected. MGM had filed for bankruptcy and was in the midst of restructuring, and while pre-production was going well, it was now fully on hold until the situation was resolved. Del Toro was stuck, 2 years and change into a project that refused to start. While he would stay on as screenwriter, it was time to leave. In Jackson's statement on his departure, he'd mentioned that no new director was helming the project just yet, and in the following months, names such as longtime Harry Potter helmsman David Yates, de facto Jackson protege Neil Blomkamp, and Wedding Crashers director David Dobkin, for some reason, would all float around the rumor mill. However, with all the delays, one director's schedule was looking increasingly open, and in October, Warner Bros. Would tap one Peter Jackson to helm The Hobbit. Jackson's work on his Hobbit films, both as producer and director, have been honestly interrogated to death on this platform. In an effort to not make this purely about the Hobbit films and to keep this relevant to video games, essentially at this point the project was still expected by 2012, and Jackson was forced to build and renovate the plane while it was already mid-flight. He was, pun intended, winging the production. At the same time, Jackson's increased involvement poised the film as much more of a prequel to Lord of the Rings than they had been under Del Toro. As production went on and as early cuts would finish up, Jackson and team would realize they had an opportunity to, quote, tell more of the tale and split two films into three. Despite the third film delayed out of a July release date, the three Jackson Hobbit films would finally hit theaters in 2012, 2013, and 2014. In 2011, a different studio under the Warner Bros. Interactive umbrella would get the opportunity to pitch their idea for a tie-in game at this time. Monolith Productions, who had long been a strong voice in first-person shooters, was reworking their idea for a tie-in to the Christopher Nolan Batman movies into a tie-in to Lord of the Rings instead. Warner didn't feel that two Batman franchises running concurrently would be an effective use of resources, so the team would begin working on a linear co-op game focused on a dwarf and an elf in Mirkwood Forest. When Warner would have concerns about both a game featuring non-human protagonists and two players, Monolith would go back to the drawing board. Taking Arkham-style combat and a protagonist who was to Aragorn what Dash Rendar was to Han Solo, the team would start work on Shadows of Mordor, a game set between the events of the two film trilogies in a way that feels similar to what Warner had requested of TT 2 years prior.
The goal we were given was to do with Middle-earth what Rocksteady had done with the Batman IP, to make a game that's not a movie game, but can totally stand on its feet as a great game within that IP.
For what it's worth, Shadows of Mordor does feel quite a bit more compelling than your average movie tie-in game. Its Nemesis system alone, the way enemy captains remember you and develop new fears and strengths based on your encounters, makes it one of the most alive open worlds in a time when they were just starting to get extra formulaic. What's interesting though is that when work would begin in 2011, its 3-year development timeline would have put it after the then second and final Hobbit film. It's only by coincidence that it acts as the tie-in game Warner wanted. Monolith's other Lord of the Rings game, the MOBA Guardians of Middle-earth, was poised more as the synergy they wanted from the franchise. That being said, in a way, Shadows of Mordor also manages to act as the bridge film the second Hobbit film was originally going to be. While the timeline isn't perfect and it certainly isn't 100% lore accurate, Talion's adventures from his time as a ranger stationed at the Black Gate to becoming an undead wraith on a quest for vengeance puts him at the front lines of Sauron's return, and has him coming face to face with not only key characters such as Gollum, but also with the story of the ring itself. For a lot of these unmade projects, it's rare for the original team to get a chance to return to their missed opportunity. TT Games, however, was lucky enough to be one of the biggest studios in movie tie-ins at this time. For a few years there, it seemed like everything was getting a LEGO game. In 2012, Lord of the Rings would be no exception. While it's definitely a LEGO game through and through, TT also seems to be reusing pieces of their Hobbit pitch in LEGO form. It's honestly one of the wildest ways I've seen an unmade game like this make it to release, akin to something like Rebellion reworking Free Radical's Battlefront 3 ideas for Elite Squadron, only this time it's the same studio with the same director. I mean, it's understandable. A team who pumps out that many games likely doesn't want to waste time reinventing the wheels and re-solving gameplay problems, but also it's just weird. That's really the only way I know how to describe it. My mouth honestly dropped when I was caught by the Black Rider and the same QuickTime event appeared. While again, I don't think this was one-to-one what their ideas and levels were, I'm glad that they got this opportunity. What's more, TT would also get a chance to make a LEGO Hobbit game. It's again, mostly just a LEGO game down to making iconic moments like Riddles in the Dark a building puzzle. However, there's some value in seeing how TT would handle things that weren't seen in the pitch, such as the way the dwarves cooperate throughout the story, or creating an open world that accommodates both locations from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. That being said, it is unfinished, ending with the Desolation of Smaug's cliffhanger. Despite requests from fans for DLC to finish the story, and even an offhand comment at London Toy Fair hinting at Battle of Five Armies levels being in development, Warner would officially announce that they had no intentions of letting TT Games adapt the third film, even in the upcoming LEGO Dimensions project that was to feature a handful of Hobbit tie-ins. It's a fitting but ultimately depressing way for TT's time with Middle-earth to come to an end. TT would continue work on their LEGO games until in 2022, following a scandal with Crunch Culture, LEGO would cancel their exclusivity deal with the company and the world of LEGO games would open back up, with games such as LEGO Horizons or even LEGO Fortnite existing in a new era. There's still some question of what the future of TT looks like. Rumors point to them making a large-scale remake of their LEGO Harry Potter games, similar to what they did with Skywalker Saga. There's a chance, however, that the team could put together something wholly new and show their potential as a studio beyond just buildable bricks. Though with recent closures from Warner Bros., I feel like that's unlikely. It's worth pointing out that director John Burton departed the studio in 2019 before the release of Skywalker Saga, however was implicated heavily in the Crunch Culture report. He would go on to co-found 1010 Studios, who would release Funko Fusion, a game that's honestly not great, but very similar to the LEGO formula.
It's interesting then, in hindsight, looking back at that Hobbit pitch. There was a brief moment where the team would have gotten out of making the same type of game, but when many members of the team started their own studio, the first thing they did was make something that felt extremely similar. It's interesting, but honestly understandable. Stability in games is incredibly hard to come by. It's rare for any studios to last for nearly 30 years, especially when making licensed games like this. TT carved out a niche and weathered a storm that killed a lot of studios. That Hobbit pitch sort of represents risk, and so part of me is glad they weren't given a chance to see it through. But as someone who loves games and hates seeing studios forced into monotony, whether that's Call of Duty, Battlefield, or even LEGO, it's hard for me to not think about what could have been.